Hello and welcome to this Fane online event. My name is Roma Agrawal. I'm your host today. I'm an engineer, author, and broadcaster. And I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome author and my dear friend Subhadra Das to talk about her incredible new book. So Subhadra is a historian who writes about science and society. And for 9 years, she was the curator of the science collections at University College London. Welcome, Subhadra.
Thank you, Roma. It's so nice to be here with you.
Oh,
Um,
it's a pleasure.
I'm only going to be interviewed by my friends from now on. I'm resolved. That's the only way this is going to work.
It's much more fun. So this job, curator of the science collections at University College London, can you tell me a little bit about how that job actually influenced where you are today?
Yeah, it sounds very serious, doesn't it? It's a very highfalutin, very serious, important position because we know that everyone thinks museums are super important in our society and that they're very well funded and taken care of. Um, yeah, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that job. And actually, a lot of the things that I have learned, a lot of the things that I am passionate about writing about and sharing stories wouldn't have happened if I hadn't done that job. I first started in 2012. The job was curator of the teaching and research collections. I shared it. It was a job share with a guy called Nick Booth, and together we took care of 11 different collections all across the sciences at UCL. Electrical engineering was one of them, and
Fascinating.
yeah, I know. And he did most of the work with that one, in fairness. Um, and my responsibility was working with pathology collections, which I write about in one of the chapters in the book. But the biggie was a thing called the Galton Collection, which is named for a man called Sir Francis Galton, who, in my experience, is like the most important Victorian scientist no one has ever heard of. And I say that with no judgment because before I started working at UCL museums, I had never heard of him. And Galton is like, for me, this thread that when you pull on him, when you pull on this thread, suddenly there is this whole world that opens up, that unravels about the history of science, the history of race and racism. And so, yeah, without doing that work and without looking into those histories, this book would never have got written.
I've heard you describe your job once as curator of the Eugenics Collection, right? Which is a slightly more specific title, maybe, than the science collection. So what happened when you pulled Galton in a metaphorical, purely metaphorical sense?
I mean, it's so interesting that you use that language because so oftentimes people were like, "Oh, this guy, you really like this guy, don't you?" And I was like, "No, I work with him. He's very much a colleague. He's not coming to dinner." Yeah. So, I mean, the reason why I say science collections is because there were all of those different ones, right? This wasn't the only one. But it really is actually, yeah, more accurate to call it the Eugenics Collection, partly because the collection includes objects that are not just relating to Francis Galton, his work and research. That was the name of the department.
Mm.
UCL was host to originally what was called the Eugenics Records Office that Galton funded. He gave money to that. And then, yeah, founding professor of eugenics anywhere in the world is a guy called Carl Pearson, who was originally professor of maths, goes on to be professor of applied statistics. So this story was a very local story to UCL. And it made sense to call it the Eugenics Collection because that's what all the other science collections were named after the departments. If it's electrical engineering, chemistry, medical physics, those are the titles.
Yeah.
That's what the science was.
Let's take a step back maybe and look a bit broader. Another thing that I love that you said was that you grew up a brown girl in a white curriculum. So can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, the Bonnie M song that never quite made it into the charts. Um, yeah, I think what I say and what I always really have to say is that like I'm the whitest brown person you're ever going to meet. It's pretty like you can't tell by looking, but you can hear it in my voice, in my accent, in the way that I have assimilated into my acquired community. And yeah, it's like I was really good at school. I went to first an English school and then an American international school in the Middle East. So my upbringing is pretty international, pretty cosmopolitan, although technically I've only ever lived in two countries in my life. But you encounter a lot of people in that kind of international community. The stories that we are told, the history that we learn, we think it's sort of the neutral history. We think it's kind of everything there is out there because we don't know any better. You know, this is the ways in which we're taught highly influence the ways in which we look at the world. And if you don't know that you're only kind of getting half of the story, then, how are you supposed to think critically against that? So what I mean by brown girl in white curriculum is the curriculum is white. If you go to Western schools, the history we are taught, the stories we are taught, the people that are brought to the fore are part of an overarching white narrative. It's an idea to do with the supremacy of Western civilization, Western ways of doing things. Inherent is that is baked in this idea of white supremacy. So I think the big thing, again, when you pull on that Galton thread, is understanding that these two things are connected, that actually race has a history based in science. It's not simply to do with civil rights and fighting against racism. It's about, where did this idea come from in the first place, and how do we dismantle it to best advantage? So yeah, a white curriculum sets us up to look at the world in a particular way. And what I want to do with this book is to encourage people that maybe there's other ways of looking at the world.
And your dad said something quite poignant to you when you were doing some project or other.
Yeah, it was, the project was, I remember it to this day, it was about the British Raj in India. And I was doing it with my friend Melissa. Shout out to Melissa, she was there from the beginning. And she was being the white lady, Victorian lady in India, on the civilizing mission, trying to get these savages and heathens to come about doing the right way. And I think I was playing like an Indian servant girl who was like massively overdressed because all my mum's saris were too fancy for the role. And we made a video, and I was showing my dad the video. And he sort of, watched and thoughtful about it. And then right at the end, having seen it, he said, you know what? They don't teach you everything. And I write about it in the book. My reaction was, duh, Dad. Obviously, they don't teach you everything. It's
Yeah,
a lot of
there's
history.
so much to learn. There's, yeah.
How much do you want me to learn? It's like, yeah, I come back with 99% on the test and you want 100. I get it. But, they have to be selective. It's only until much later that I started to realize just how selective the story was.
Yeah. And this is about active erasure, perhaps, rather than, like you say, being selective about what stories want to be told, rather than what the broader thing is, and particularly what the perspective of the oppressed person or peoples is in this particular case.
It's true, but I also kind of want to, like, no shade on my teachers. They really did try very hard to direct us away from the curriculum. I had a history teacher who pointed me to a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me that was in our library. I didn't read it at the time. I've read it since. And, they really did try to broaden our reading list, what we were reading, all that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, these things are systemic. They're teaching because we have tests to take and pass, and their jobs and our livelihoods and future careers depend on it. So in a way, it's like, yeah, what stories get told, but also like, what is the system that holds all of these things in place?
So you talked about your cosmopolitan upbringing, and I'm definitely one of those citizens of the world, or citizens of nowhere, as some people would like us to call ourselves. Um, One of your chapters of your 10 chapters, so you've structured the book so that you've got these 10 chapters which are about these 10 specific lies that you've chosen to address in more detail. And one of those is nation. So yeah, between the two of us, we've lived in a number of countries. We may even speak a few different languages. I think we've got quite a few different perspectives. What does it mean to belong somewhere and to contribute to the culture or the work of that place?
It's treacherous, isn't it? It's like it's really hard. Like I said, I grew up in the Middle East. My parents were Indian. They were expats. They followed the money to good jobs. I should point out that they both worked for the NHS in the UK before they made that move. And part of the move was because my mum, who became a consultant when she went to the UAE, but she'd hit something of a glass ceiling for an Indian woman doctor working in the UK in the 1970s. Yeah, it's like I went to these schools. I was presented with this view of the world. First of all, that these are the places that are more civilized, they're more advanced, they're more progressive, more liberal. You can be yourself when you can't in these supposedly other backward, uncivilized places. I mean, the lived reality of that was never quite true to start with. But there was, an aspiration, a goal, wanting to go to university. in the UK because I had this picture in my head of where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And when I got here, I met people, I made friends, I gained ambition as to what I wanted to happen. And all of it sits very precariously on which visa turns up and which ones you're able to get.
And you said that you felt quite British or English even as a child growing up in Abu Dhabi.
I sounded like this as a 5-year-old. It's like, what do you want? How much more do I have to
And you
do?
were reading about like British boarding schools and
Yeah, there's a
little
lot of Enid
detective
Blyton.
children and yeah.
Yes, all hideously problematic now. Between the Enid Blyton and the Roald Dahl and even the Charles Dickens, it's like, yes, we need to think critically again about the diet that we feed our children, in terms of what it means to be educated. But like, yeah, I had a picture. It's nice here. It's
Mm.
pristine. It's a beautiful country. By and large, people are warm and welcoming. It feels like you are welcomed here. As would be the case, I think, in lots of other countries all around the world. It's just that, the UK talked a big game. I remember when I got my student visa to come and study archaeology at University College London, had to go for my interview to get the visa properly stamped, or what, I can't, there was some process. And the first question the guy asked me was, why do you want to come and study in the UK? And I was so arrogant and 18 years old. And my reaction was, the syllabus said that it was the best degree in the world. Is that not right? Am I not supposed to come here? Um, and I was like, this is not the welcome with open arms I was expecting. Also, for
Mm.
somebody to paying fees, well, not me, but my parents were paying fees
Yeah.
multiple times in excess of what home students were
Yeah.
paying. So it's complicated, but it's tricky. Um, it really, it can be very heartbreaking when the people who get to tell you where you do and do not get to make your
Mm.
life are people who have no idea who you are. And also, if we look at kind of the history of immigration legislation in this country and how overtly racist it has been, that's a precarious position to put yourself in.
Yes. I feel you with a not dissimilar trajectory. I want to move on to the pen is mightier than the sword, but you put it in Latin and I had to look it up. What was it in Latin?
Oh no, the Latin one is the first one, nullius in verba.
Oh,
Take me
okay.
for it. Yeah.
Okay,
Uh,
fair enough. Okay, so the pen, the writing.
tell me about the pen.
The one of the stories that I really loved, because so in my book where I write about engineering, I wrote about string, and I really loved that you had this whole thing on string in this chapter. One of the things that people do as historians and archaeologists, you will allow me to mansplain this to you, is
Okay.
that you're looking at written records of people's pasts and making well, I guess creating understanding about them and so on. And we thought for decades that the Inca in Peru had no writing, but you've said actually no, that's not true. So then tell me, why am I talking about the Inca and writing in string all in one sentence?
It's because not only did we think that the Inca didn't have writing, we thought that it was known. It was like a known thing in archaeology and in history. This thing called the Inca paradox, which is what we did know was that the Inca had a highly advanced society in terms of architecture, in terms of economics, in terms of empire. I mean, they're a relatively recent empire in the neighborhood. They're on the rise after a period of instability when the Spanish turn up. Um, but yeah, this was the question. It's like, how do these people uh, have this advanced level of society, civilization, but they haven't got any writing system? Um, and so that was the so-called paradox.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then of course, it was considered, they probably weren't that civilized to start with, even though they were building these amazing cities high up
That we're all
in the.
going to visit all the time, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and then of course we need to give careful consideration to the idea that is it aliens actually that are building these things. So I
Oh,
I,
of
I
course
also
it's aliens, yeah.
so
Totally.
I touch on the very racist arguments that like brown people aren't capable of doing these things for themselves. But yeah, the thing about the Inca, the Quipu, and the string is that the string is the method of recording. So it's even tricky to talk about it in terms of like what writing is, because writing is a
Mm.
very particular kind of technology. Um, but the string for the Inca is a means of recording history, of recording pedigree, family, And it's really complicated, and it is actually a very engineering approach to recording history, because what they are able to read, the way the quipu work, as I understand it, is that you have these parent strings that go across and you have other strings that are tied, and that various knots are tied at different points on the string. They're tied in different directions. It's possible to read in terms of the ply, in terms of the color, in terms of the material that's being used. So, I mean, talk about materialism. This is a highly embedded way of recording things and being able to read and understand and record people's own history. And there must have been something to it, because the Spanish ordered a lot of them to be burned. So it's there's something going on there, in terms of knowledge and power and how we kind of hold on to it. But the point that I wanted to make about that was, not only was this really amazing recording technology there in front of our faces the whole time, it's there in museums, it's there in collections. No one in the West even thought to look at them until relatively recently. You've got a couple of scientists, Urton and Medrano, based in the US, who started to look at these, started to compare with written Spanish records and see that there were comparisons that could be made. So yeah, look at what's been lost because we didn't credit people with enough civilization.
So yeah, what I'm hearing is that there was first of all an assumption that without writing, they're uncivilized, if I'm being kind of simplistic about it. So there's a judgment placed on civilizations depending on how the records are made, and is it the same way as we do it?
Mm-hmm.
And then when anthropologists, scientists, historians have seen the quipu, they're looking at it, but it doesn't even occur to us to think, what are these? Can I really kind of understand this and assume that these are actually quite sophisticated models of something, rather than thinking, I don't know, maybe this is a piece of art or this is some, something else. So there's a lot of assumptions built into it, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. That's very much the point. And the point I was trying to make in that chapter particularly is, how do our assumptions about people frame and shape the ways in which we treat them and think about them? And in this particular case, that's another very clear example of erasure. They're just gone.
They're gone. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I need to let that point sit. Dear viewer, please absorb that. Talking about art then, so you've got a chapter on art, and I mean, I've learned so much from that chapter. I've learned so much about the value we place on art, who decides how valuable art is, who decided that Leonardo da Vinci is somebody that we should spend a lot of money on for his works and so on. But the story that I found really interesting, the comparison point, was that the world all kind of leapt up in indignation, rightly so, when the Taliban blew up the Buddhist statues in Afghanistan. But you're reminding us that Napoleon's soldiers blew up ancient Egyptian monuments. So why don't we see these acts in a similar light?
Yeah, well, I think it's because we have views of who is civilized and who is uncivilized. If anyone was familiar with that story, the moment you mentioned Napoleon's soldiers and blowing up statues, they'll know to finish the sentence by saying, oh, they were blowing them up so that they could move them and put them in the museum.
Which museum?
Well, now, I mean, interesting question. That is, by the way, a very old joke. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but like, why are the pyramids in Egypt?
Because they're too big to be blown up?
Beautiful. No, because they were too big for the British to put them in the museum.
Oh,
So obviously the French wanted to put them in their own museums. They were destined for the Louvre. But they didn't have the wherewithal to blow up those statues effectively enough. In the end, it took an Italian, engineer, circus strongman turned engineer, to come up with the techniques whereby these things could be moved efficiently, effectively, and then he was working for the British, so they ended up in the British Museum. But yeah, that kind of, it's this Indiana Jones principle. Indiana Jones, by the way, famous trader in illicit antiquities. Not an archaeologist in any kind of way, shape, or form in terms of my education, which, by the way, I was super disappointed in, because like he was one of the main reasons I wanted to study art.
So you have the hat somewhere.
I think he the hat and the whip were donated to my department at UCL, sold at auction for charity. So literally, yeah, those things were there. But we need to remember, it's only when you do these things and start rewatching the movies, it's like there's literally a line in the movie where Denham Elliott says to Indiana Jones, yeah, thank you for going and stealing that thing. The museum will buy it as usual, no questions asked. That's
Says a
literally
lot.
I mean, it's like saying the silent part out loud, really. Yeah, so the fact that correctly, we should be outraged at the Taliban blowing up the monumental Buddha sculptures in the Bamiyan Valley. We should also be hideously outraged as the way they treat women in their society. We should be hideously outraged at the way that they treat other people in their society. These are not people who I want to emulate. I'm not holding them up to say, hey, look, this is the way to be. But what I wanted to make the point and there is actually, why did they blow up those statues? Because actually for 3 years previous, they had been being hideously oppressive, being a fundamentalist political state that was hugely disruptive to people's lives, and nobody had noticed. But they knew how to get the West's attention, because we like the art. We might not care about the people, but we like the art. So when the art is threatened, that is the point at which we start to sit up and pay attention. And it's a story that's repeated itself in quite hideous ways in various different aspects of conflicts in various parts of the world. Important to point out that the reason why the French wanted to move and the British wanted to move those sculptures out of Egypt was because they thought the Egyptians, who had built them and whose heritage it was, weren't capable of taking care of them. There's a violence in this idea of care.
Again, deep breaths and allow this to permeate. Then I want to come to the last chapter. So can you first of all, explain what the last chapter is about?
The last chapter is called We're All in This Together. Which, by the way,
Sarcasm, hashtag sarcasm.
Well, so many hashtags, and I'm trying to level at some level of neutrality here, because I do want people to think for themselves. But we all remember where that phrase came from. By the way, a little bonus, which is that wasn't the original title of that chapter. There was a different lie in place. So prizes to somebody who can work out what the original title was. I think it's kind of obvious from the text. But this idea about society in the West, it's built on ideas of meritocracy, which other people actually have written whole other books about why that's not the case. But also, the police are coming to get me just as I'm talking about it as well, because they don't like us talking about these things. But yeah, the idea about this chapter was, what is it in terms of Western notions of individualism, liberty, freedom, democracy? They're all built on this idea that we as individuals have a certain level of autonomy, have a certain level of freedom within the society to be who we are, to act as we want. But that that this kind of society exists. It clearly doesn't exist in any kind of neoliberal co-option. The irony of the title is, it's very obvious we're not all in this together. But I also wanted to look into this story from the history of psychology, which is the story of Abraham Maslow and his high hierarchy of needs.
So
And
can you just describe what that is in case we're not familiar with that?
Sure. Although it'd be interesting if you weren't, because it's like kind of an icon in Western culture, in business studies. But it's a triangle or a pyramid, and the idea is that the base is like your physical needs. So things like clean air, food, water, shelter, safety are at this base layer. And then you work your way, as an individual, you work your way higher up the pyramid. You have social needs, you have emotional needs that you need the people around you to kind of feed into. And then one level up again is esteem. So you start to build your own self-esteem. And then at the apex of the pyramid, right up at the top, is this idea that Maslow came up with, which is self-actualization. And Maslow, in very typical Maslow style, said very few people ever reached the pinnacle of this hierarchy. He listed himself, Mahatma Gandhi, and Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, quite key early 20th century figures. are listed there, but he's like, not a lot of people make it up to the top.
And what does self-actualization mean?
I mean, great question. As Maslow described it, it's the idea that an individual, a person, does things because it is inherently kind of self-motivated. It's like it's the thing that drives them. It's their passion. You need to go and find your passion.
Mm.
Um, it's an ancient idea as well. I mean, Socrates wrote about it. And Plato and all of those guys. I'm struggling to remember which one exactly which, but this idea of kind of, and might even be ideas to do with a Platonic ideal. If you're a musician, you should make music. If you're an artist, you should make art. Just to go back one little step, because so many of my friends are artists, they make their living by being artists. I'm not decrying the value of their work at all. I'm just trying to highlight that there's systems of inequality inherent in all of these things. So for Maslow, it's like in your life, the thing that you do should be the thing that fulfills you the most, that gives you the greatest joy, and that you are driven to do. So you and I are hitting the mark here quite handily, right? It's like, we're writers, we are kind of in that area. But we all of us need to acknowledge, and I certainly need to acknowledge that, none of us gets here on our own. There's elements of inherited wealth, as is obvious from our conversation. There's elements of privilege in terms of other aspects of our identity that we're able to mobilize. So yeah, the pyramid is problematic, primarily because it then got co-opted by business studies. And so this idea of the ideal individual in the workplace. So you get the idea was that if a workplace can create this top bit of the triangle for everyone, you create these happy workers, and then they're at their maximum potential for feeding again into the working system.
And that doesn't sound like a terrible thing.
Well, it does if your working system is going to suck you dry,
Mm.
which is what we talked about in an earlier chapter about time.
Yeah.
Whose time is it? Whose work are you doing? Who owns the clock? Who owns you in terms of how much work you're willing to put in and what you're getting out of it? So yeah, it's this aspect of, well, capitalism is at the foundation and the heart of all the things that are wrong in this scenario. Because yeah, that pyramid doesn't exist in the absence of the system that we already work in. The other thing that's wrong about it is, of course, that the model that Maslow, let's be generous and say, was inspired by, did not put self-actualization at the if they had a pyramid, if they were going to have something at the top of it, and they probably didn't because they didn't think in those hierarchical ways, self-actualization wouldn't have been the thing at the top. The thing at the top would have been transcendence.
So tell me who the they were in this
Yeah,
case.
we absolutely should. They were the people of the Blackfoot Nation that Maslow kind of ended up being bullied by anthropologists of his acquaintance into spending time with. So he spent about 6 weeks at Siksika, which is part of the, I don't want to say capital, but it's like one of the centers of the Blackfoot Nation. It's about an hour's drive away from Toronto. Blackfoot Confederacy crosses the Canadian and the US borders, and was there first, obviously. And Maslow originally starts out as your very standard behavioral psychologist, which is that, he's doing experiments with monkeys, actually. People may remember famous experiments to do with pigeons being taught how to play ping pong. How do we motivate, and dogs being keyed to salivate? How do we as individual organisms react to our environments and work within them? He'd come up with a theory of sexual dominance. His idea was that, well, we're relatively early in the evening, but we're also grown ups talking about this. So big dick energy was his kind of theory as to how power works in our society. I'm actually being fairly euphemistic about it. His interpretations were considerably more violent and considerably more sexist. So he'd come up with this theory. He felt like it was a universal truth, but it so happened that he was in New York, he was teaching in Brooklyn, and he fell in with some anthropologists. Particularly a woman called Ruth Benedict, who has, to my mind, one of the best quotes in the book. Ruth Benedict says, universal values are themselves suspect. So in this world of civilized, uncivilized, we're not thinking, if there's a single rule and we think it applies to everyone, we are probably wrong. So she set Maslow a challenge. She said,
This is quite a humble take on things. So
yes, yeah. It's because she's part of this school of anthropology that's actually kind of undermining all of the hideous racism that is built into the system already. So yeah, Benedict and Margaret Mead, who I mentioned later in the chapter as well, are part of this generation who were taught by a guy called Franz Boas, who his view is, well, actually he came to America and he was like, these savage people are kind of nice and they're kind of clever and they're kind of kind. Uh, Maybe they're not as savage or as uncivilized as we thought they were. So this was the ethos into which Maslow accidentally stumbles. To begin with, he's still very resistant. He goes to the Blackfoot Nation and he nearly gets kicked out because he's like, fill in this questionnaire. Questionnaire, by the way, invented by Francis Galton as a technique for psychological investigation. So yeah, he's there, he's struggling to kind of work it out. And because the Blackfoot are so reluctant to participate in this kind of way of thinking, he eventually kind of has to succumb. And he's like, okay, fine, I'm going to be an anthropologist. I'm going to ask questions, but I'm going to listen to the answers, I'm going to observe. And what he observes is a society that is built on a fundamental principle, which is that no person is left behind. I learned a lot about this from a lecture by a guy called Ryan Heavyhead. So do look up his lectures on YouTube. He talks very eloquently and at length about this. He talks about the idea of people being credentialed, is that when you are born, there is an acknowledgement that you are a human, that you exist, that you don't have to work to contribute value to a society, that you don't have to earn your place in a society. It's there already. It can be lost, and even then that's quite a hard thing to do. But it's the very antithesis of this Western ideal of we have to work to prove our worth. We have to contribute to our society. There are certain people who are a drain on our society or who are skiving and not doing their full bit. This would be a completely alien way of looking at the world from the point of view of the Blackfoot Nation. Their point of view is if you're hungry, you should have food. If you're unhoused, you should have a roof over your head. Your community should be helping you to do that, but also you as an individual. When you are self-actualized, your next step up is transcendence. What can you do for the people around you? That's a real model that we're all in this together. In the West, it does not exist because of the capitalist and other systems that are set up that are just divide and conquer. You know, we're taught to resent other people that we think are not contributing enough. We're not taught to help them or feel compassion for them.
What does the society of Blackfoot people look like as a result of this model?
It's difficult for me to say because I did not have the budget to travel everywhere where I wanted to be able to look at this. But my understanding is, and we take their word for it because that is how this thing works, is that it is a society that is fundamentally kind at heart, but it's also one that is more carefully embedded in the world around it. There are aspects of a longer view. There are aspects to do with thinking about climate change and the human impact on it. I'm not, by the way, trying to set up Native American or Indigenous First American peoples as some kind of noble savage. That's not the goal here, is to say that they are perfect, that they are untouched. Ryan Heavyhead talks in great detail about the ways in which the Blackfoot Nation had to try to survive economically and the ways in which both the US and the Canadian governments thwarted them in their efforts because they were very successful business people. But it's a world which thinks about 7 generations past and 7 generations future, and thinks about the influence of those things that happened in the past, but also thinks about its actions now and how that's going to impact the world in the future. Heavyhead actually said that he had people from business studies come to the Blackfoot Nation and say, have you heard about Maslow and this hierarchy? You all should think about working out your society like this. You shouldn't have tribal elders. Everyone should be more equal, etc., etc. And it's just laughable. It's just like, you know, he's like, you've got to laugh at this. They brought our own way of living back to us and tried to teach it to us. And to me, this is the great arrogance of the West, really, that's kind of built in, this idea that we think we do everything better than everyone else, but also this short-sightedness that we think ours is the only way of looking at the world. I'm not saying that it is always harmful. I'm just saying that whenever people try to tell you that it's the only way, that it's the most advanced, that things are actually great, maybe you should shut up and stop complaining. they're not speaking from a point of information.
The two things that I'm taking away from this conversation, just to kind of have a point of reflection in our chat, is about having, I think number one is humility, to think that maybe the way that I live and what my values are and what my relationship is to my work, to my country, to whatever that might look like, my health, might not be the best or the only way. So that's point number one. And then from that basis, there's curiosity. So the idea that you do want to learn with this kind of humble curiosity about other people and about other ways of doing things, to see, I guess, what you can learn I mean, does that resonate?
Hugely, yeah. Thanks. That feels kind of spot on. In a way, there is a straw man aspect to this argument. We've heard it. We've definitely heard people, and we've definitely heard people who are like overtly racist in their outlook on the world say, before we got to you, you were eating with your hands, and you know, it was like you were disease ridden, and our science saved you, and all that. These sorts of narratives, they exist. They are ill-informed. They are incorrect. Science is a global endeavor. Eating with your hands is fine.
It's the best. I mean, it's the best. I mean,
I mean,
honestly, yeah.
again, we want to move away from this way of thinking that one way is better than the other, but like objectively, it's the best.
True, fair enough.
Yeah. And also, by the way, there's like highly sophisticated technology. Like it isn't just like we don't just shovel. Like there's techniques for how different.
There are techniques and chopsticks. Like chopsticks, I use chopsticks to, like, if I'm, I don't know, making a burger on a pan, I get the chopsticks out to flip them.
Yeah, because it's like it's an extension. It's at a much more extensive, sort of intuitive extension of your hand using chopsticks. Admittedly, if you're not brought up using them, it can take a minute to get you.
Yeah.
But like you don't just go around like poking everything. That's not the only way of like going about the world. I feel like somehow, yeah, the dining metaphor is a useful one. It's like the Western way of looking at the world is either with a knife to cut things up, or with a fork to prod them with. But yeah. We like a metaphor. We're writers. But yes, and I realize how I sound. I realize, you know, we're in this fancy event that's talking about books and ideas out in the world. So I'm always mindful, or try to be, of my own privilege. I don't want to come across as arrogant, but I'm appreciative of the fact that to a lot of people I do. But there are other stories out there. They just, you know, they've been here all along, and actually they feed into our stories in ways in which, because we are ignorant of them, in point of fact, we're missing out on so much. We're missing out on the Inca and the Quipu. We're missing out on the Blackfoot and their notions of the world. How much more interesting and how much more fun could it be if we suddenly, you know, if we were to just open our eyes to the fact that there are these other ways and these other people that exist?
Yeah, let's be more curious. So I wanted to talk about science a little bit, because that's one of the big areas of overlap with us, because I write like popular science books, nonfiction. You've written your first chapter, in fact, is about science. And one of the things that I found like fun and funny, I guess, in both of our work and both of our writing, is that we all have that uncle, don't we? We've got that uncle. If you're a fan of Goodness Gracious Me, Subhadra and me are like 80s babies, therefore loved a bit of Goodness Gracious Me in the 90s in the UK. And, you know, Sanjeev Bhaskar's character, Uncle, is telling everyone how William Shakespeare is Indian, and how Superman is Indian, and how everything is Indian, right? Like,
Leonardo da Vinci actually was another one.
was that one of them? That's excellent. Leonardo da Vinci, Indian. And we're all rolling out. I mean, I roll my eyes at, and when I say uncle, it's not even a relative, right? Like it's general older Asian man that somebody knows. And we all have that uncle. But am I turning into that now? Like, am I doing that thing where I'm like, oh no, but this comes from the global south, or this comes from somewhere else? And one of the stories that I really enjoy is about optics and about the lens and about light. And we talk about the Dark Ages.
Yeah, I just
feel
we
talk about
take a moment out of gratitude to you. Just everyone really should.
No, thank you.
Really should read. All of the things that we're about to talk about are in this book. So it's important that because
Oh,
out of
thank you.
gratitude for being here, thank you very much for doing this.
Oh, I appreciate that. So so the story that I like is Dark Ages, 1000 AD to somewhere. We're in the Dark Ages, and then we've got the Renaissance, and then we've got Newton, and that's not the whole story. And
Mm.
we write about this, and there's an Indian uncle in here somewhere going light, Indian, lens, Indian. Tell me about that.
Okay, so this is like multiple previous iterations of the science chapter. So readers beware that the science chapter in my book is very much shorter than it was when it first started, because there was a lot to do actually as far as this was concerned. In terms of saying science has never been a solely Western endeavor, to tell the story of the lost Greeks, the fact that the Greeks were rediscovered in the Renaissance would not have happened had it not been for the Arabic sources that kept hold of them. Not only kept hold of them, preserved them, but transcribed them, translated them, and added their own influence.
And that's the key bit, right? Because a lot of the story is that that's what the Arabs did, was preserve Western knowledge, but actually there's more to the story than that. So I
Mm.
often ask my audience, like, have you heard of Isaac Newton? And everyone's like, yeah, obviously we have. And I'm like, well, actually, have you heard of Ibn al-Haytham?
Mhm.
And I think I've had one hand up in the entire year that I've been talking about him.
Mhm.
But he existed 700 years before Newton. He says that his religion, Islam,
Mhm.
taught him to question all knowledge that came before him, and he saw that as his duty. And I find this interaction between science and religion very fascinating. But I mean, that's a whole other topic that we could go on about for an hour.
Which I also wrote about and got cut completely, yeah, from the thing. Yeah. Mhm.
Oh, interesting. I think we need to release like an outcuts of Uncivilized.
Yeah,
Um,
between yeah, well, and yeah, between us, I feel like we could, yeah,
we've got
definitely.
good outcuts. Um, he looked at the Greeks. So the Greeks believed that the reason we could see was because our eyes shot out essentially like lasers. You can almost imagine it. Like your eyes produced light, which then bounced off an object and then came back to your eyes and went, aha, this is what this object is.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, what did they then think the problem with darkness was? Because I couldn't quite work out, like,
Yeah,
surely if it's dark, you can still then, but darkness was seen as like a miasma, kind of a thing, like a
thing that comes in.
material that comes in. And this is all great, right? For a couple of thousand years ago. But Ibn al-Haytham was a bit like, hold on a second. I'm just going to use a bit of logic here and go, if it's the light from the object to my eye that's actually doing the work of allowing me to see, why do you need that first bit of light in the first place? And in fact, what he did was he was the first person, he drew a cross section of the eye, which showed a lens. He explained that like rays of light can kind of cross each other and not interfere with each other. He said that light bends through materials like glass. He got the reason why it does wrong, but he understood that it did and what that meant. And so there was this incredible amount of work, and he in fact has written, the Book of Optics, the tome, which Isaac Newton later studied.
Yeah, it's like, Isaac Newton just, the story is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
Um, but I wish he'd cited the sources slightly more carefully and just listed exactly which giants, because some of them are Arabic giants.
Mm.
And the mathematics that's involved, a lot of that comes from South Asia. It's this idea of, I mean, and here's another story that got cut, was the vaccination story, because Western notions of vaccination are actually fed by West African notions that are embroiled in the trade in enslaved African people. Our history is so much more global and so much more cosmopolitan. And yeah, it turns out maybe Uncle was right.
Everything's Indian. It's all Indian. The lens is
Well,
Indian, light is Indian.
not just Indian. And we need to problematize Indian as well, because, like, the Raj is a different thing from like India as a modern nation. And we should include Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and, all the other places, Bangladesh. So, but yeah, it's like, this is the thing. It's like suddenly, they may not teach us everything in a white curriculum, but we have it within ourselves and the wherewithal, like Ibn al-Haytham, to open up our eyes a little bit wider and take a look.
No pun intended.
blazes out of them. No, no pun intended.
No pun intended.
The
I mean,
metaphor. Metaphor.
metaphors. I have a degree in physics from Oxford, and I'd never heard of Ibn al-Haytham until sort of 2, 3 years ago when I was writing my book. So I mean, I think that really says something. Obviously, I know about Newton, but didn't know about him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you mentioned a little bit about your science chapter being heavily edited, cut down. You probably could have
In a
written
good way. In a good way.
in a good way. You probably could have written a book about every chapter in the book, and I always find that a big challenge. But let's talk about the craft and the process of writing. This is your first book. How did it go for you? How many times did you call me?
Yeah, I called you a lot. Well, no, but and credit to you as well. And can I just take a second, because you were there. We were in your car driving up to Leeds to get matching best friends forever tattoos.
Leicester, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, that's right. It's one of the places in the middle of England that began with an L. And I said, I really want to do this. Do you think I can do this? And you didn't even miss a beat, and you were like, yeah, you can. And then followed the proposal that was accepted, the brilliant editor. Shout out to Harriet Poland. Without whom this book, I mean, it was her idea, so this book wouldn't have happened without her. But in terms of the process, yeah, research is fun, isn't it? Writing, not so much. Writing is very much first world problems here, by the way. But yeah, I definitely fall into the writing is hard camp, which turns out I think is actually the vast majority of
I think
writers.
it's everyone.
Yeah.
I've decided all writers find it really hard, even if they're like 15 books in, it's still like blank page syndrome.
Yeah, just gonna go back to the beginning. I think there's only like a couple of, sorry, is the light blinding you there as well? I'm
Well,
mindful.
it was the light of the blank page that I can currently see for my own next book. Yeah.
There we go. It's poetry. Yeah, apparently nobody enjoys doing this, but everyone feels compelled to do it who does it. So yeah, all power to all of us. It's been a fun process. It's nice to be at this end of it. But yeah, I'm now at the thing where I'm like back at the bottom of the hill again, looking upwards.
Well, you did it, and you've done it brilliantly. And I'm really excited for the coverage. I'm really excited for people to hopefully buy this book, which is so enjoyable, and I learned so much. And I think it all comes down to, for me, that humility and curiosity to just learn more about the world from a more global perspective, and all the joyful, wonderful things that you can learn from reading this book. So you've put yourself in the book quite a lot. Like, I love the little stories about your dad. I love the stories about the debate where democracy was defeated. That one really tickled me. Could you talk a little bit about bringing yourself into your writing?
I'm glad you liked that democracy story. I remain traumatized.
Could we give our viewers a bit of context on that one?
Yeah, so this was it was a debate in my old high school, and it was me and my classmates in advanced placement advanced placement US history. So we were doing US history, and we were juniors. So we were in year 11, it would be here.
Okay.
And so we were up against the senior class, which is the year above, who had already done the course that we were halfway through doing. And they were doing European history. And so if they knew anything about demagogues and monarchy and all those sorts of things. So the debate was democracy or monarchy, which is best?
And who were you arguing for?
We thought we had these easy, but we thought we were doing democracy. So we thought it was going to be easy.
Yeah.
And I think everyone thought it was going to be easy. But it turned out, whoa, those guys really brought it. I think I mentioned it in the book. I was on the podium. I was in the bit of the cross-questioning or the cross-examination. And one of my very dear friends, like dear friends, was like, and so would you like to tell me why you're siding with Hitler? And I was like, well, genuinely, it was like taking a cricket bat to a puppy. That's how I was the puppy. It was hectic. It was very, very, very intense. And they won. They won the debate. Because this is the nature with debates, which is why I think they're bad things, by the way. And as a rule, I do not do them. Which is that in a debate, it's the person with the best argument that wins, not necessarily with the best idea. And it turns out that douchebags are really good at arguing. So we should always be mindful of this. So yeah, that was funny enough. The memoir bits actually were probably the easiest bits to write. Those are the bits that just sort of flow out of you, but they're the easiest bits to write, but the hardest bits to share.
Mm.
For anyone who listens to the audiobook, brace yourself for the end of chapter 9, because I wish I had. I read the audiobook and I talk about very personal stories there. So
Yeah,
like a warning for grief there.
no, totally. And maybe this brings us to your chapter on death, which is probably that's the one you're talking about. I'm
Yep. Mm-hmm.
um you went on Radio 4 and claimed that death was the best medicine. Can we quickly discuss that? Because when you first told that to me, I was like, what? Which I expect was most of the audience's reaction. But you got named like co-winner or something at the end of this
with
show.
the with the other Indian girl who was on it. So like brown girl representation was strong, was really strong that day actually, because Rialina was the comedian who was on the panel there too. So yeah, we were representing.
And she
Um,
she had play, I think, as her best medicine, and you had death.
yeah, so Dr. Goody Singh, who was the other person who won that evening, and let's be fair, if she'd been on her own, she would have won anyway. But she talked about play, and that's what and we actually were talking about the same thing. We were both talking about, from different angles, an appreciation and taking a joy in life.
Mm,
Um, Most of the chapter about death, I talk about working in a pathology museum. I talk about how in the West we keep death at a distance. The science, I think the phrase I use is we rationalized ourselves almost to death. The science is so far advanced that we can keep people alive, their hearts beating, their brains generally zapping over. But what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to interact with our fellow people? And what does it mean to take joy from, or indeed just acknowledge again people's humanity? There's a reason why the death and the individualism chapters are next to each other.
mm,
It's because here is like again in our society, and the counter story I use there is Haiti and zombies. And I talk about a society that is very poor. But nonetheless, they keep people with mental illness very close at hand. They keep people that we run away from in the street or ignore or get kind of freaked out about, or we put them away in institutions. We keep them at a distance. They bring them in. They take care of them. They bring them into their household. They feed them and clothe them and bathe them when they can't bathe themselves. And I just thought, wow, here again is a model for taking people just as they are and not demanding that they contribute something to the overall society. So it was a very touching story. And I think the point about death is, and the point I made on best medicine is, death is the best medicine because you only get one dose. It focuses your mind into thinking about what's important.
mm. And talking about focusing your mind, there are at least a few chapters that I wish could have been included in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I wish there was a chapter on language,
Mm-hmm.
one on religion, and maybe one on gender. And you
Yeah.
mentioned that gender is actually one that you deliberately you thought about it. And I mean, some of these are deliberate decisions that you made. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you edit as a writer and how do you decide what stories go in and what gets left out?
Yeah, so gender was going to be a big part of it. In point of fact, I was going to try and take on all of the various systemic inequalities that are shaped by eugenic thinking in our world. Race is the big one. Eugenics makes race a broad church. But alongside that are issues to do with disability, to do with sexism and sexual identity, and to do with class, and also to do with body size. And when I was writing the chapter about justice, the story there in the West was all going to be about the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment in the US, because in the United States, women are still do not enjoy equal legal footing with men. So without wanting to fall too deep into it, because I really did, but I was going to talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and all the work that she did with the American Civil Liberties Union, also the work that she did as a Supreme Court judge. I realize she's slightly more controversial figure now in the aftermath of her having died, and having died in the role. But I think if we look back at her career, we can see just how much work she did. There was a science story that was also about a guy called Edward Drinker Cope, who was associated with a thing called the American School, who came up with the idea that it's a white supremacist idea that white people represent the greatest advancements in civilization because they are the only race to properly demonstrate the sex binary. So, newsflash for those of you who didn't know, trans people exist, they always have. The sex binary is a very recent development in terms of anthropology, in terms of the history of looking at human society. And ideas that the sex binary, A, exists as a binary, and B, something that is biologically ingrained, is an invention of American and European scientists in the late 19th century. So, as you can see, because it took me all that effort to just set the thing up for you, that's a whole other book.
Mm.
And in point of fact, I wonder whether I am the best person to write it, because having just said all of that, and also having looked into the history again of trans and non-binary people and how important they are in terms of Indigenous voices, Indigenous appreciations of gender and how it is materialized, I don't think a cis woman can do justice to that story. But I would encourage that whoever does includes those histories of science. And we should mention Alok
I
Vedmanan.
was about to do that exact thing.
Hmm.
And so I think both of us follow an activist called Alok Vedmanan, and they they review a lot of books on the topic and very succinctly explain what these books are trying to say, and they're based in science and so on. So if you want more information about these topics, I would definitely encourage you to follow their account.
Hmm.
I think we're running out of time now, sadly.
Yeah, well,
What is one thing that you would like people to take away from this conversation and from your book?
I think I would echo your ideas to do with, humility and curiosity. But I would also then, once you've built the humility and gone and found out stuff, I think we need to start to acknowledge the overarching systems that are at play here, the way that knowledge reproduces itself, the way that systemic inequality to do with race and all of those other aspects of our identities, how those are reproduced. And yeah, once we open our eyes again to those things, start to acknowledge those structures, we need to start to break them down at the very least. Depending on the day of the week you catch me, I'm like, burn it all. But we need to start to dismantle those structures that perpetuate the inequalities that we insist upon between ourselves. They don't need to be there.
Thank you. So this was Subhadra Das, historian who writes about science and society. Her debut book called Uncivilised, 10 Lies That Made the West is out, and I would really strongly encourage you to buy it, to read it, to learn, and then to go and dismantle things as Subhadra has described. I nearly called you Zaria, which is my daughter's name, so
I love
says
that.
something about our relationship. I have been Roma Agrawal. I'm an engineer, author, and broadcaster. You can find both Subhadra and me on Instagram. We both have websites. You can fill out web forms and say hi, and we will reply to the nice messages for sure, I think.
We'll try.
Thank you so much for being part of this Fane online event.